Hello, everyone, and welcome to artifact number 9 of Module 1. We are transitioning today from the art of the Greek world into that of the Roman world. And in order to really fully consider this shift in cultures, we need to look at a map to understand the ways in which, during at least the early republic, the Roman world has expanded to a remarkable extent, and it will get bigger as the Roman world moves onward. I mean, there's a famous saying that all roads lead to Rome, and this is certainly true by the time we get to the High Empire and Rome has reached its greatest extent. So up into the period of the transition to the early empire, and that is with the elevation of Augustus as sort of the emperor god of Rome, you can see that the Roman world has taken over almost all of Spain, all of what is now modern day France and Belgium and part of the Netherlands, all of the Italian peninsula, of course, all of the Greek Peloponnesus, and then it's spread as far away as over here would be India, to say nothing of the fact of northern Egypt, all the area of the Nile, and then much of North Africa as well. The world is Roman, and the roads actually make it possible because they can march places quickly. During the leadership of Hadrian around 125, and even Trajan a generation earlier, the Roman world begins to overtake many parts of Germania as well, to say nothing of the Pacific or the Atlantic islands. I'll show you a picture of Hadrian's Wall in a little while. That was a wall constructed around 120 under the rulership of Hadrian along the narrowest part of what is now England. And everything to the north of that wall was not Roman. Everything to the south of it was. Like the Greek world, the Roman world has a variety of different periods within it. And understanding these periods will help us understand the transitions within Roman art, from the idealistic art of the early period to the bodies that look a little more squat and powerfully built in the high and then the late empire. So let's begin. The Roman world, we think of it as being founded in 753 BCE by Romulus. There is kind of a story of the founding of Rome, that it was founded by Romulus and Remus, who were, there's a picture of the she-wolf, who were abandoned on a hillside, nursed by a she-wolf, and and then the city itself went on to be founded by one of those twins, the twin of Romulus. This begins a monarchy within the Roman world, and monarchies then, like monarchies now, were primarily passed along from a father to a son. In the Republic, this will change, where it will go from father to an adopted son. So there's not going to be a genetic link between those. But in the monarchy, it's from father to son and father to son until eventually that ends in 509 when the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, is kicked out. The Republic begins this time frame where we have a kind of a government that is elected, right? And we breezed over this when we spoke about Greek art, but Greece is a democracy. I mean, the word democracy is a Greek word. Demos, D-E-M-O-S, is the Greek word for man, but they mean it in like mankind. And krasi, which we see a lot of, like theocracy and democracy, that means rule of. So beginning around the year 509, we have the creation of a Roman Republic in which we have senators who are elected. This lasts until around the year 27 BCE. And it had been transitioning in some ways. And if I were to ask you to name your favorite Roman ruler before you got in here, You might name Julius Caesar, mostly because he might be the only name you know. And Caesar essentially consolidated power and kind of made himself emperor. He was killed on the Ides of March in 44, and this began an incredible civil war. The victor of that civil war was Octavian, who was, for lack of a better phrase, Julius Caesar's adopted son. Octavian eventually proclaims himself Augustus. This is a Latinized word for first, and this is the beginning of the early empire. There's still a Senate, but we have a primary leader. And the early empire dates from 27 BCE, which is when Octavian becomes Augustus, and goes through the end of the Flavian dynasty. So from an architectural point of view, the Colosseum is the Flavian amphitheater. So that dates from this time frame. The High Empire from 96 to 192 in the Common Era, this is maybe the high point of the expanse of the Roman world. They're the so-called good emperors, and Commodus, who decidedly is not. After Commodus, the Roman world goes through complete political upheaval for a period of about 150 years. And these are the soldier emperors, and it's a new emperor every 18 months. They kill the emperor before them, and then their emperor, and then another guy with a sword and an army comes and kills that person. They rule for about 18 months, and then that's repeated until about the year 337, when we have Constantine moving the Roman world from Rome over here to Constantinople, which will be over here. So that is the Roman history in just a nutshell. Our focus today will be on sculpture, and in Artifact 10, we are going to look at Roman architecture and talk about some of the key developments during this time frame. In order to really understand Roman sculpture, we need to talk about the difference between the Roman conceptions of self and the Greek conceptions of self. Not once could I have shown you a Greek bust statue, and that is a statue of only the head and shoulders, because the Greeks don't think of the head and bodies as being disassociated from one another. But for the Romans, this is no problem. And as a result, the Romans utilize bust statues, statues of heads, as a way of reinforcing lineage. Who your father was and who your grandfather was of keen importance for the Roman world. And this works its way into statuary. So if I had my head carved in marble, I would pass that along to my son, who in turn would have his head carved in marble. And these would move from generation to generation within the same family as a way of establishing lineage. You get the idea that some of these things still work in some parts of the world, right? That in the Northeast, that there is a keen interest in family lines. I mean, I think about the ways in which legacy admissions work at Harvard or Yale, that your dad went there, so you will go there too. Sort of the same way in Rome. The idea of family lineage is really, really important. This statue never could have existed in the Greek world. We never would have had a person holding a bust of two of his ancestors. There's something else that's really common within the Roman world that maybe doesn't exist in the same way in the Greek world, and that is the idea of verism. Verism. Verism is a blatant adherence to visual truth, even if it's not flattering. And this bust of a Roman patrician, which is sometimes called the Torlonia head, is a great example of that. So let's talk about patrician and plebeian. Patrician is a Latin word that means leader or wealthy person. And if you wanted to be a member of the Senate, you needed to be a part of this class of people. The first qualification was that you were a landowner. And if you weren't a landowner, you never could have been part of this. And you and I have thinking we have a different sort of criteria for landowners because I'm a landowner. I got three acres just outside of Ruston, but that's not good enough for the Romans. If you're a landowner, you're a remarkably wealthy person. And the other class of people, and if I were alive in the time around the historical Jesus, no doubt I would have been one, was the plebeians, the patricians and the plebeians. And historians have estimated that 1 to 2% of all Roman men were patricians. They're the ones who own land, they're the ones who can work for the government, they are the ones who are eligible to vote in the election of the councils. So this is a picture of one of those. And I think we can agree that this man has been shown as if he is remarkably aged. Like his face looks like a topographical map. He is an old guy. And let's think about words that we would use to describe the elderly, like nice words to describe the elderly. Um, so when I was 28, my grandma Zygmunt died, and she was 94. She died of stomach cancer, and she died in January. The last time I saw her was in Thanksgiving of 2004. And I remember going to her house and sitting down with her and just like looking at her, and I knew this was the last time I was going to see her. Like stomach cancer is tough on anyone, let alone a 93-year-old. And I just sat down with her and said, "All right, Grandma, make me smart." And I said this to her a lot, and it was essentially, give me some wisdom, because wisdom is not something you can rush, right? Wisdom is is knowledge acquired over decades of time. Now, let me be clear here. My grandma Zygmunt was not an educated woman. She was the oldest daughter of 8 brothers and sisters, and her mother died when she was 13. So from the time my grandmother was 13, she wasn't going to school anymore. She was taking care of a family. My grandmother finished elementary school, but nothing beyond that. So by all marks and measures, my grandmother was not an educated person. I mean, when she died, I was a breath away from my PhD. By all measures, I'm an educated guy. But my grandmother had something at the age of 93 that I did not have at the age of 28. And heck, I'm 44 now. I still don't have that. And that's wisdom. This man with wrinkles and crow's feet and sagging skin, he has wisdom. And in a way that might be different from our own world, the Romans valued wisdom. They valued age. Age and wisdom go together. You've never met a wise 19-year-old. I say this as someone who was 19. You're not wise. I'm not wise yet. The Romans valued age in a way in which I don't think our culture does. And you might think, stop it. And I say, I'll give you a good example. Here you go. I give you the current Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. She was Speaker of the House. She wasn't Speaker of the House. She's now Speaker of the House again. She might not be Speaker of the House in 2 years. Who knows? But here she is. And I ask you to guess Nancy Pelosi's age. This is her official on the House of Representatives portrait, website portrait. This is Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi is, wait for it, she's 79 years old. Now, I say this as someone who's 44. I'm going gray. I'm going gray. Like it's really prevalent in my beard and like my sideburns, but it's starting to creep up upon my sides of my head too. And here is a woman who is, wait for it, 35 years older than me. Not a gray hair on that head. Her skin has been pulled tight by some kind of surgeon, taut across her face. Now, by all accounts, her job is his job, and she's older than him. But she has not been shown young because our culture does not value age. Former First Lady, former Senator, former Secretary of State, former presidential candidate. not a gray hair on her head, and she's older than my mom, and my mom's been dead for almost 20 years. Our culture does not value age in the ways in which the Romans did. And this is remarkably clear by looking at their statuary. We have thousands of statues of Roman men being old Roman men. And when we come back to a very basic idea, one we've talked about before, who is in control of the relationship between art maker and the patron? We know it's the patron. So whoever this guy is, he was happy with this object because he paid for it. And if he didn't pay for it, he would have smashed it. But it survives. This all begins to change a little bit as we march through the Roman world. And here's a great example of this. This is a statue of Augustus. It dates from the end of or the beginning of the second decade of the era before Christ. We lovingly call it the Augustus from Prima Porta because it was found in the town of Prima Porta. And it's a really interesting object in a couple of really interesting ways. In order to really understand that, we need to know some of the key elements of Augustus and his life. Let's start by thinking about what we see. So to begin with, we have Augustus standing. In his left hand, he's holding a staff. We can kind of call it a staff of leadership. And in his right arm, he has raised it pointing, and this is a very classical pose of oration or addressing a crowd. When we speak in front of a group of people, the effective speakers make good use of gestures. And we get the idea here that Augustus is talking to a group of people. He has been shown with that Greek contrapposto that we explored in a previous module. Here we have a weight-bearing leg. Here we have a non-weight-bearing leg. It looks as if he's striding forward. And we know it's Augustus on the basis of the ways in which his head has been shown. Statues of Augustus exist quite literally in the hundreds. Here's a great example of a bust of his. And you can see here his hair often looks like this. One of my professors in graduate school described the crab claw that often shows up along his hairline. Likewise, portraits of his wife, Livia, show up in numerous iterations all around Europe. And so we know this is Augustus. It's his portrait. This is who he was. And one of the really important ideas to keep in mind as we explore Roman sculpture and architecture is the high regard that the Romans had for the Greeks and their world. And so it's not surprising that this sculpture is in many ways a ripoff, at least as it exists here in the lower body of Polykleinos's Doryphorus. I mean, if you look at just a detail of these two objects, you can see here that they are quite honestly identical. And this is a really important idea, that they are borrowing this object for a use of their Roman rulers. This gives you a great idea as to how far back that leg goes. Now, you might be wondering what's going on with this object, because in many ways, it is kind of complicated. And everything is in a work of art for a reason, as the meanest professor in graduate school I ever had once said. And so we need to explore, because this work of sculpture does political work for Augustus. One of the sentences you'll hear me say as we march along in this class is, art does work. Art does work. Art does work for those who pay for it. There's a reason why somebody would have paid for all of this. And it wasn't because they were just well fed that day and didn't need to buy dinner. People often commission works of art as a way of doing political or social or religious work on their behalf. And this object is no different. Although the way we see it now in the Vatican Museum is very different than what it might have looked like when it was first constructed. As a matter of fact, a museum in Copenhagen, maybe a decade ago, did an exhibit of casts of Roman works and painted them as they might have originally looked. And I'm going to show this to you in a second. It's going to look scary to you, but one of the things that is true is that we often think of these sculptures as being perfect as they are. White marble, good enough. But the reality was they would have been painted originally to make them look more lifelike. And so when I saw this for the first time, I shook my head and like kind of rubbed my eyes and thought, wow. But in a lot of ways, it makes sense. This purple that you see is going to be the imperial color. This is the color that the Roman emperors are going to wear. And later, I'll tell you a secret. It's the color that Jesus will be shown wearing too. This has become such an accepted form of what this statue that originally looked like that when you go to the Vatican and see the statue, here is that same picture, more or less, next to the statue over here. I mean, this is commonly accepted now to be, this is what it looked like. In some parts of the statue, primarily on the backside, you can still see very small flecks of color that remain. Augustus is shown in a very interesting way because if we look at his upper body, he is wearing armor, right? This is not actually his upper body, it is armor. And this armor, this cuirass, has been incised with some narratives that provide us with a story. So here is a sort of image from the book, and here is part of it that a picture I took a couple years ago. So at the beginning of that, you can see we have this figure here. This is a sky god. You can see his head, and he's sort of holding up the sky. And over here, we have an image of Augustus on a quadriga. A quadriga is a fancy Latin word for four-horse chariot. And over here is a statue of Nike, victory. So on one side of this, or the top part, we have Augustus riding a chariot, chasing after victory. And underneath it, you can see two things. One, we have a Roman soldier. I'm not sure that it's Augustus, but it's certainly a Roman soldier with a Roman dog standing here. And over here is let me go back, I beg your pardon, is another soldier, and he's holding a Roman flag. And so in the years prior to Augustus becoming emperor, the Roman army had lost a battle. And although it wasn't a crushing military loss, one of the things that happened was their standard was stolen. And the idea of losing your flag was a matter of honor. You don't lose your flag. And I grew up in Arizona. I'm not sure if you guys played this game in your elementary schools in Louisiana, but we played a game sometimes called Capture the Flag. And the flag was a stand-in for, like the standard. Like the goal was to run over and grab like this thing and run it across your line before the other team could catch you. And so this idea of losing their standard was a matter of honor. In the next battle, Augustus took the army back to that same field and had the standard returned. When you see this object in person, they have removed this staff here because it's a modern reproduction, but you can see the slot here. It would come through his hand as like a symbol of power. Now, you might be wondering, why is he wearing armor and no shoes? Because I've never gone into battle, but if I had gone into battle, I can tell you one thing for certain, I would be wearing shoes, and he's not. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. Augustus, once he becomes, or Octavian is his birth name. And once he becomes emperor, he changes his name from Octavian to Augustus. And in doing so, he becomes a kind of god, sort of like the Egyptian pharaohs in some way. He becomes deified. There's a process called an apotheosis, and that apotheosis involves his deification. Gods don't wear shoes in a battle. Like they don't nothing to worry about. They go in barefoot. And so this is a symbol of his deification. And when I showed you the image of the Doryphorus, I showed you a detail of the lower bodies, and here it is again. And you might be wondering, what is this little thing here? And we talked about this tree trunk here. It provides support for this leg, and that's something we need when we're dealing with marble statues. You need to support that because it can't freestand by itself. It needs to be attached to a base. This over here does the same structural work as this, but that's a tree and that's not. So what is this scary little thing, and what is this undecipherable thing here? And it's actually kind of funny. That is a depiction of Cupid riding a dolphin. And you might be thinking, Brian, that doesn't look anything like Cupid riding a dolphin. And I would say two things. One, the only reason you know what a dolphin looks like is because of like TV, Planet Earth, and the internet, and not because you've ever seen a dolphin. I don't know that I've ever seen a dolphin in real life. Maybe it's SeaWorld. I bet it's SeaWorld. SeaWorld doesn't exist for the Romans, right? And think of all the things that you only know through like TV, pictures, or zoos. Like, I've never seen a great white shark in real life, but I know what they look like because of the Google machine. And so this is what the Romans thought dolphins look like. And dolphins show up in all kinds of crazy ways within the Roman world. There it is. This is a little bit better of a detail. It looks like his poor snout has been smushed up. So you might be thinking, why is there a baby riding a dolphin? And I would say to you, that's not a baby. That is a dolphin. That's not a baby. Or that's just not just any baby. That is Cupid. Cupid. That's Cupid. Now you might be asking the next question, and I would go along with it. And that is, why is Cupid riding a dolphin? Why is he there? And actually, this is one of the images, one of the things that does work. Cupid, as you know, like when does Cupid show up in your life? Cupid shows up around Valentine's Day. Why? Because Valentine's Day is a day for lovers. And why does Cupid show up on Valentine's Day? Because Cupid is the son of Venus, right? Venus is the Roman form of Aphrodite, and Aphrodite and Venus are the Greek and Roman gods of love and beauty. Well, what does love and beauty have to do with Augustus? And the answer is everything. Everything. This object here is what makes this work political. Augustus was Octavian. Octavian claimed to be the nephew of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar claimed to be a direct descendant of Aeneas. Aeneas was the founder of the Roman Republic through Romulus and Remus, and Aeneas claimed to be the son of Venus. And this becomes even more clear if you ever read Virgil's Aeneid, a Latin poem written in the 1st century BCE that was commissioned by Augustus. And that work of literature does the same political work as this work of sculpture. This thing ties Augustus through Octavian, same guy, to Caesar, to Aeneas, to a goddess. That's one of the reasons why he has bare feet here. This woman wouldn't get out of my picture, so I've been showing it in class for the last decade. This is not just a statue. It's a statue that does political work on behalf of Augustus. This shows his relationship between the goddess Venus and also establishes his political might. But Augustus has another role within the Roman world, and here is a demonstration of that. And actually, both of these statues are in the Vatican Museum. This is Augustus as Pontifex Maximus. When you go to Rome, and you should, you will see the abbreviation Pont, Max everywhere. Pont is an abbreviation for Pontifex. That means priest. Maximus means great or head. And this phrase becomes used by the Pope as a way of designating their title. Not until much, much later, but it symbolizes Augustus's role as high priest in the Roman world. And so these things exist all over the place. This is Augustus as military leader, and this is Augustus as religious leader. And the idea of using sculpture as a way of speaking to political might is one that is exceedingly common. This is a great example of that. Not far from the Colosseum, an object that we will look at during Artifact 10 is this. This is the Arch of Titus. And this is an exceedingly famous arch. It's not the first triumphal arch, but it is but it is one of the most famous. And a triumphal arch is a large-scale gateway that a Roman emperor would construct and then march through as a way of commemorating their departure and to some place where people don't look or think like them, their defeat of those people, and then their victorious return. So in this instance, in the year 79, Titus, of the Arch of Titus name, took the Roman army to Judea and conquered Jerusalem. Jerusalem, then as now, was primarily occupied by people of the Judaic faith. Titus did not like that because they refused to honor Roman gods. I mean, the Jewish Bible, what's the first commandment? There is one God. There's only one God. And the Romans have many gods. Titus was one of them. And what do you have to do to the gods? Well, you have to tithe to them. And so because Judea was under Roman rule, they expected the Jewish population to adhere to Roman gods. They didn't want to do anything like that. And so Titus brought the army to make them think otherwise. And what do you do when you're done conquering an army? Well, you take back their stuff. And so on the inside panel here, and let me make sure I have the side right, it would be this side over here. There is a narrative of the army of Titus carrying back all of the artifacts from the Temple of Solomon, including gigantic menorahs. This Arch of Titus does a very similar kind of work for Titus as the Augustus of Prima Porta did for Augustus. It chronicles a great victory in a lot of ways. The triumphal arch would have been set up, and when Titus and his army returned from this battle, they would march through in triumph through it. There are, at least in the Roman Forum, no less than 4 triumphal arches. The Arch of Titus, the Arch of Trajan, the Arch of Septimius Severus, and the Arch of Constantine. All in the Roman Forum. You can practically throw a stone next to all of them, depending upon, I guess, the strength of your arm and the weight of the stone. The next person we're going to look at is going to be Trajan. And what we're going to spend most of our time looking at is the column of Trajan here. But the column of Trajan was originally an incredible overall complex that had a temple, a basilica, and then a forum. we think of a forum now in slightly different terms, but in the Roman world, a forum was an outdoor marketplace. And the outdoor marketplace and the column itself was constructed around 112. As a matter of fact, 112 in the Common Era is a really important year, for it was in that year when Trajan had a great victory over the Dacians. The Dacians are a group who live in kind of what is now modern day, well, maybe northern Romania. The place where Trajan went to was along the Danube River, and what did Trajan do? Well, he went there and brought an army and killed people who didn't look or think like him. The first time I went to Rome was in 2005, and when I got there, I was disappointed to see that the entire, well, at least the lower half of it was covered in scaffolding because they were doing restoration work on it. The Column of Trajan is a really interesting object because it is an incredible carved marble pillar that spirals upward, a gigantic continuous narrative that essentially chronicles the Dacian Wars. And so it is essentially a moving panorama, a comic book strip that shows this entire campaign. And what's fascinating about this, it's all carved in relief. Right? It's carved in relief. And what's interesting is the size of this register here is like 2 feet tall. The size of the register at the top is 3.5 feet tall. So the register, if we were to go back to our Sumerian phrase, register, gets bigger as we spiral up this column because the distance that you're seeing it becomes bigger. Another thing that happens is the relief also changes. The relief in the lower part here is relatively shallow, although you can see the shadow that is sort of projecting here. As you go up, the figures become greater and greater. So the structure itself changes from shallow relief to higher relief and smaller register to bigger register. Now, to really understand this object, we need to talk about some interesting things here. And as a way of getting there, I'll talk about my Grandpa Clark. I've already talked about Grandma Zygmunt. Let's talk about Grandpa Clark. So when I was a wee little kid, and my grandparents were visiting us, I noticed that on my grandfather's forearm, and I forget if it was a left or right forearm, there was a gigantic bump. And I once asked him what that was, and he said, "Well, that's shrapnel." And of course, I was like 7. I didn't know what shrapnel was, and it was metal that was underneath his muscle that they had never removed from World War II. My grandfather was a forward observer on a tank unit during World War II. Actually was on the cover of Newsweek in 1944, which I think is really cool. Was awarded a Bronze Star, which is really cool. But he had this, and I was convinced that my Grandpa Clark was some kind of war hero. And I guess like Bronze Star is kind of like a war hero, but I had seen like war movies, and I once asked him like, what was it like in the war? And he said, well, stop thinking about the movies because the movies make it seem like the war goes on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. And in reality, a lot of what we did was march, or he rode on a tank, I suppose. And then you waited and you ate. And then you had like 4 hours of complete and total terror. And then you marched 20 more miles over the course of 2 days. And then you waited. He's like, more than anything, we were bored and hungry and wet. It's like, and then we were terrified for 4 hours. But I never really thought about the ways in which war isn't always like people shooting at you. This narrative is that. It shows the everyday events of what happens on a campaign. You build fort, you build bridges, you shear sheep. It's far more everyday events than fighting events. And what's fascinating about this object is we see those things. I mean, this is an image of prisoners being brought before Trajan. Here is the creation of what the Romans called the testudo. They were going to attack the fort over here, and they run up on the fort, covering themselves with their shield. Testudo is the Latin word for tortoise. So this element, this column, gives us a kind of life-size view of what war was really like. And when you look at it now, it looks a little bit different than what it would have looked like when it was completed around 112. I mean, here's a statue at the top of it. Here's a better image of it. And if you look at that guy and you look at that guy, you can notice something. It's not the same person. That's Trajan. That's not. So let's think about this. Who is this? First of all, he's standing. He's cast out of bronze, right? So he's cast out of bronze, and atop his head there, that is what you and I would call a halo. And a halo we commonly see around people, at the very least, who are Christians and very likely are saints. Trajan, not a Christian. As a matter of fact, in 112 in the Common Era, it's against the law to be a Christian. So he's not. This person is also holding something. You see what those are? What is this person holding? At the end of this class, you'll recognize it no problem. He's holding keys. He's holding keys because he is St. Peter. And St. Peter holds the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Who sits at the pearly gates? It's St. Peter, thank you very much. And so we often see St. Peter holding keys. He becomes, in some ways, a symbol. These keys become a symbol, not just for the church, but for the papacy more broadly. This will become very common. And so here we have St. Peter holding keys. Isn't it interesting that on the top of a statue for Trajan, we have St. Peter been placed there? And the reason for that is actually quite simple. Originally, there was a Trajan, and at some point in history, when Rome stops being pagan and begins being Christian, the Christians look up and they see Trajan, and you know what they say? They say, that's Trajan. He's burning in hell. Let's pull him down. And so they pull him down, they melt him down, and what do they put up top of him? They put a St. Peter. Not far away from Trajan's column in Rome is the column of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius has a St. Paul on top of him now, which I really, really enjoy as well. And so Marcus Aurelius is actually one of the good emperors. Although he is not a Christian, we have a cool statue that survives of him. And this is it. This is the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. It has been out, or was outside in the Campo di Leone for a long time. Here it was in 2005, but they have now moved him inside and and put a copy on the outside. This is an equestrian statue, which means quite literally, it is a statue of a man on a horse. So again, this is the outside version. This is the original as it was outside. This is a modern copy. So when you go to the courtyard now, you will see a modern copy. And if you walk through that door here, he is in a brand new exhibition space in the Capellini Museum, and it is just fabulous, the exhibition space. It's completely naturally lit, and here you can see it. Now, I ask you a question, and I ask you this as someone, I've never actually been on a horse as far as I know. Many of you might have actually been on a horse. So my question to you is, usually, who's bigger? The horse or the person? Because I've never been on a horse, but I think horses are generally bigger. And yet in this instance, Marcus Aurelius is so huge. This guy's enormous. So one of the following two things is true. I guess maybe three things. Number one, Marcus Aurelius is shown riding a pony. or two, he's shown much bigger than what he really was. And that's actually what is the case, that he's shown on this huge, powerfully muscled horse, but also in remarkable control of it. He's shown bigger than it to suggest his imperial control. This was cast from bronze, originally gilded, so originally covered entirely with gold leaf. And Marcus Aurelius survived for one simple reason. If people would have known around the year, I don't know, 600, that this was Marcus Aurelius, a pagan emperor, they would have taken this dude down, melted him up as quick as you please, and made at least one and maybe two St. Peters out of him. But they didn't think it was Marcus Aurelius. They thought it was Constantine. They thought it was this guy. And Constantine is commonly thought, true or not, to be our first Christian Roman emperor. And because of that, Marcus Aurelius survived. So the only reason he does, though, is just kind of dumb, stupid luck, really. But he survives through time rather than getting melted down. As a way of wrapping things up, let me show you a statue of Constantine, because I just showed you a coin. Here, let me show you this. This is a work that is now attached to St. Peter's, or pardon me, St. Mark's in Venice, and it's called the Four Tetrarchs, and this dates from around 300. So I grant you, we've gone ahead about 12 decades, but think about how the human body has changed, right? Let me show you, let me go back and show you Augustus just as a way of driving this point home. If Marcus Aurelius was an intermediary, this is the Augustus of Prima Porta, right? That's an idealized, almost looks like he's Greek kind of body. And now we have a man who has the same job, Roman emperor, and he's been shown much different. Remember when we talked about the Polykleitos statue of the Doryphorus? I said that that word, spear bearer, wasn't the original title. The original title was canon. Canon meant the accepted proportions. Think about how the proportions have changed here, that the head looks much bigger compared to the body. That change is really, really important. The four tetrarchs symbolizes the shift in the Roman world from having a single emperor to the Roman world being split to a Western Empire and an Eastern Empire. So Rome around 300 has officially split. It's gotten so big that they've decided to divide it into Eastern and Western halves. And because for 100 years we had the soldier emperors who killed, one another, what they decided to do at the end of the 3rd century in the Common Era, again, 3rd century is 200 to 300, what they decided to do was to have kind of a emperor and vice emperor. And that way, somebody could kill the emperor, but that person who killed him doesn't become emperor themselves. It goes to the vice emperor, and then the vice emperor would then choose a successor. And so around the year 300, what we have are 4 rulers in the Roman world: an Augustus for both the Western and Eastern Empire, and a kind of vice emperor for the Western and Eastern world. That is going to change. It doesn't last long. And when you look at these statues, right, and these are carved from what's called porphyry, it means purple marble. It's such a beautiful stone. You can see here that this guy with one arm is giving him a hug, and he has this arm wrapped around him. You can kind of see his claw there. But you get the idea, don't you, that they don't exactly trust one another, because with the other hand, both of them are holding their swords. It's like, I trust you, but I don't really trust you. Imagine, do you know why we shake hands? This is kind of a fun fact. The reason why people historically have shaken hands is to show that you're not holding anything in that hand that can harm somebody. This is like the shaking of your hand, but holding a sword in the other one at the same time. We're going to come back to Constantine and the shift in worlds at the beginning of our next module. But our next artifact in Module 1 is going to deal with the ways in which the Roman rulers will use architecture to very specific ends as well. So this one, we've looked at sculpture and the ways in which sculpture does political work for our Roman rulership. Next time, we do sculpture, architecture.